Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in U.S. history. Before we start, please let me know where you're watching from and what time it is when you're listening to this narration in the comments. We want to know how far these documented accounts go and what times of day or night they happen. The events that would change the lives of everyone on the Caldwell Plantation forever began in 1834. The plantation was in Tolbert County, Maryland, on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay. It was like a silent witness to all the wrongs that happened during that time. The main house was on a low hill that looked out over acres of tobacco fields that went all the way to the water. Dozens of enslaved people worked the fields, but only one name has survived in history: Samuel Green. He wasn't born with the name Samuel Green. William Caldwell bought him at an auction in Baltimore 20 years earlier and took that name from him. Samuel was 18 years old at the time. He was strong and clear-eyed, even though he had seen a lot of terrible things in his short life. William Caldwell only saw the work that Samuel's broad shoulders could do. He thought about how much work his body could do before it broke down. But under Samuel's careful look was a mind that saw, thought about, and remembered everything. By the standards of Maryland's eastern shore, the Caldwell Plantation was only moderately successful. William Caldwell got the land from his father, James Caldwell, who had gotten it in the late 1700s when the country was growing after the Revolution. The main house was made of brick and had 2 stories. It had white columns that held up a wide porch that went around 3 sides of the building. The kitchen house, the smokehouse, and the slave quarters were all behind it. The slave quarters were out of sight of visitors who came down the long oak-lined drive. A group of rough wooden buildings where Samuel and 23 other enslaved people lived in conditions that William Caldwell never checked on. 5 years before our story starts, William's wife, Elizabeth Caldwell, died giving birth. She took their stillborn son with her, and any softness that might have been left in William's character. Since then, he had become more and more bitter, and his cruelty toward the people he owned had grown stronger with each passing season. At their social events, the owners of nearby plantations talked in hushed tones about how his mood had changed. They said it was because he was sad, but they secretly wondered if the darkness had always been there, just waiting for a reason to come out. By 1834, William Caldwell was known throughout Tolbert County for how harshly he treated the people he owned. People had called Thomas Harrison to the plantation many times to treat injuries that couldn't be explained by accidents alone. But no one stepped in because at that time and place, slaves were seen as property instead of people. The law protected William Caldwell's right to do whatever he wanted with the people he owned. The community's sense of right and wrong had been warped by racism and greed for a long time. Samuel Green had lived on the Caldwell Plantation for 10 years by making himself necessary. He was smart and observant, and he had learned to read even though it was against the law for slaves to be able to read. He kept this information to himself because he knew that if someone found out about it, they would be severely punished or worse. Samuel would read whatever scraps of newspapers or old books he could find at night by the dim light of candle stubs he had collected from the main house. This helped him learn about the world outside the plantation. Samuel learned about the growing abolitionist movement in the North, free black communities in places like Philadelphia and New York, and the Underground Railroad, which helped enslaved people escape to freedom during these stolen moments of reading. These bits of information stuck in his mind and grew into a dream that got clearer every day, the dream of being free. Samuel wasn't the only one who wanted this. Martha Turner was one of the enslaved people who lived on the Caldwell Plantation. Martha had been on the plantation longer than Samuel. She came as a child when William Caldwell's father was still in charge. Martha, who is now in her early 32nd, has survived by becoming an important part of the main house's daily life as the cook and housekeeper. She had learned to read and write in secret, just like Samuel, thanks to Elizabeth Caldwell before she died. William never found out about this deal, and after his wife died, Martha made sure no one knew she could read and write. Samuel and Martha became close because they both knew a secret and wanted to be free. They always talked in whispers so that no one could hear them, and their talks were mostly about plans and what could happen. They carefully gathered information about the overseer's rounds, which neighbors might be helpful, the schedule of boats going north on the Chesapeake, and the safest ways to get through the woods around the plantation. They knew that escaping would be dangerous and could even kill them if they were caught. But the risk seemed to be worth it, as William Caldwell's behavior became more erratic and violent. In the spring of 1834, something came up. James Rutledge, a tobacco merchant from Baltimore, came to see William Caldwell. They had been doing business together for years. Rutledge was a tall, scary-looking man who looked like a successful businessman. His hair had turned silver at the temples by the time he was 50, but his eyes were still sharp, and he didn't miss a thing while he was on the plantation for 3 days. Rutledge was different from many of the merchants who worked with the Maryland planters because he was known to have moderate views on slavery. He had said in public that slavery would eventually have to end, but he believed in gradual, compensated emancipation instead of immediate abolition. Samuel was told to take care of Rutledge while he was there by bringing his bags to the guest room, making sure his horse was well taken care of, and being ready to help with any requests. Samuel first heard Rutledge talk about his views on the future of slavery in America when he talked to William Caldwell over dinner on the first night of his stay. "The writing is on the wall, William," Rutledge said. Samuel could hear him from the porch where he stood in the shadows. "The pressure from the north gets stronger every year. Most of England's colonies no longer have slavery. We should get ready for the changes that are sure to come." William Caldwell reacted right away and harshly. "The British can do whatever they want with their colonies. We know how things work in Maryland. My father built this plantation with the help of slaves, just like his father did before him. I won't say I'm sorry for carrying on what they started." "I don't think you should apologize," Rutledge said in a calm voice. "I just think you should think about where the wind is blowing." Many planters are already switching to paid workers because they think it will save them money in the long run. It often costs more to keep enslaved workers than it does to pay them wages, especially as they get older. "And who would work my fields if I didn't own slaves?" William asked. "Blacks who are free? They would ask for too much and not do enough work. People who come from other countries? They have ideas about equality that don't belong here." The conversation went on like this all night, with Rutledge making economic arguments for gradual emancipation and William Caldwell stubbornly defending the institution that gave him wealth and status. Samuel took in every word and thought about what they meant. Here was a rich and powerful white man openly talking about the end of slavery, even though his timeline was longer than Samuel wanted it to be. That night, Samuel and Martha talked about what he had heard, and a plan started to come together. Rutledge would stay at the plantation for 2 more days. Maybe the merchant would help them get away if Samuel could somehow talk to him directly. It was a risky move, but every day that went by, staying under William Caldwell's increasingly unpredictable rule seemed worse. Samuel had a chance to talk to Rutledge alone the next morning while the merchant checked on the tobacco fields. William Caldwell had to wait at the main house because a neighbor showed up. This gave Samuel the chance he needed. "Sir," Samuel said quietly as he walked up to Rutledge, with his eyes down, as was expected. "I heard what you said last night about how things would be in the future." Rutledge looked surprised, but not mad. "Did you hear what we were talking about?" "Not by choice, sir. I was doing my work on the porch." This was only partly true because Samuel had set himself up on purpose to hear. "I see. What did you think of it?" Rutledge asked. And it seemed that his curiosity was stronger than any offense at being eavesdropped on. Samuel took a deep breath and thought about what he was going to say. "I think you're right, sir. Things are going to change. I've heard people talk about it who have been there, and I've heard of places in the North where men like me can live free." Rutledge looked closely at Samuel's face. "You are a smart man, aren't you? I think more than Caldwell knows." Samuel didn't say anything because he didn't know how to respond. "Are you able to read?" "Hey," Rutledge said all of a sudden, lowering his voice. The question was dangerous because admitting to being able to read could lead to harsh punishment. But Samuel felt that this might be his only chance. "Yes, sir. I learned on my own." Rutledge's face showed that he really respected the other person. "Sir, this is impressive and dangerous knowledge in these parts." "I dream of freedom," Samuel said, feeling stronger after Rutledge's answer. Not just for me, but for everyone here, especially Martha, who works in the house. We've made plans, but we need help to get to the north." Rutledge's face changed, becoming more closed off. "You're asking a lot, Samuel. What you want to do is against the law. I could lose my business and my place in society." Samuel pushed on, knowing he might never get another chance like this. "You talked about change that would happen no matter what last night." Rutledge said, "I was talking about gradual economic changes, not illegal flight of property." But his tone didn't sound very sure. "Sir, are we just property? Or are we people?" Samuel asked, looking Rutledge straight in the eye. They heard William Caldwell's voice calling from the main house before Rutledge could answer. The merchant quickly moved away from Samuel. He said quietly, "We won't talk about this anymore. Get back to work." Samuel's heart sank, but he had to do what he was told. Rutledge whispered, "Meet me by the stables at midnight," as he turned to leave. "Only bring what you really need." Samuel and Martha got ready to run away that night, feeling both hopeful and scared. They only told 2 other people about their plan, Isaiah and Ruth Brooks, an old couple who had been on the plantation since it opened and would cover for them as long as they could. The 4 hugged each other in the dark of the slave quarters, crying as they realized they might never see each other again. At midnight, Samuel and Martha sneaked away to the stables with small bundles of things they couldn't bear to leave behind. These included a wooden carving Samuel had made of his mother, whom he hadn't seen since he was a child, a piece of fabric from a dress Elizabeth Caldwell had given Martha, a small knife, some dried food, and a rough map Samuel had drawn based on descriptions of the route north. James Rutledge was waiting for them, just like he said he would. His face looked grim in the moonlight. He whispered, "My wagon is behind the tobacco barn. I've made a fake bottom for you to hide in. I'm going to Baltimore at dawn." "Caldwell thinks I'm leaving a day early because of work issues." "Thank you, sir," Martha said in a shaky voice. Rutledge said, "Don't thank me yet. I can only take you as far as Baltimore, and the trip will be dangerous. After that, you'll need to get in touch with others who can help you get to the north." Samuel said, "We get it. We're ready for anything that comes." Rutledge nodded with a serious look on his face. "Then go to the barn and hide until I come for you at dawn. Let's hope no one finds us." The hours until dawn went by so slowly it hurt. Samuel and Martha huddled together in the dark tobacco barn, listening for any noise that might mean they had been found. They whispered to each other about the future they wanted to build, the chance of getting to Philadelphia or even further, and how they would someday help others escape like they were being helped. Even though it was risky, there was a thrill in taking this step toward freedom after years of being forced to follow orders. They heard footsteps coming closer and tensed up, ready to run if they had to, as the first light of dawn brightened the eastern sky. But Rutledge was the one who looked tense and motioned for them to hurry to the wagon that was waiting. The false bottom he made was small, but it would keep them hidden from people who weren't looking for them. A voice broke through the quiet of the early morning as they got ready to get in. "I thought better of you, Rutledge." William Caldwell was 20 yards away, pointing a shotgun at the merchant's chest. In the dim light, his face looked like a mask of cold rage. "Get off my property," Caldwell said again, moving slowly. "I had my doubts when you said you would leave early. It looks like they were right." "Be reasonable, William," Rutledge said, raising his hands in a calming way. "The world is changing. These people deserve—" "They're not people," Caldwell cut in, his voice getting louder. "They are mine, just like this land and the tobacco they grow. You are trying to steal from me." Samuel moved in front of Martha to protect her, his mind racing to find a way out. Rutledge kept trying to talk sense into Caldwell, but the plantation owner's face showed that he was beyond rational discussion. He was so angry that his face was red and spit was flying from his lips as he yelled about betrayal and the natural order. What happened next happened so quickly that later accounts would disagree on the details. William Caldwell stepped forward, waving the shotgun around a lot, and tripped on some uneven ground. The gun went off, but the shot went wide, and scared the horses that were tied to Rutledge's wagon. Caldwell lost his balance completely and fell as the animals reared in fear. Samuel ran up to him, planning to take his gun away before he could get back up, but Caldwell was already getting up and swinging the shotgun like a club at Samuel's head. Samuel raised his arm to protect himself, and the gun barrel hit him hard, sending a shock of pain through his body. He fought with Caldwell, and both men fell to the ground in a desperate fight for the gun. Martha yelled at them to stop, and Rutledge tried to calm the scared horses while also trying to break up the fight between the men. The shotgun went off again. When the sound of the blast stopped, there was an eerie silence. Even in the dim light, you could see a red stain on William Caldwell's chest that was getting bigger. He was lying still on the ground. Samuel stood over him with the shotgun in his hands, looking horrified and shocked. "God in heaven," Rutledge whispered as he looked from Caldwell's body to Samuel. "I didn't mean," Samuel started, but his voice let him down. "It doesn't matter what you meant," Rutledge said quickly. "A black man has killed a white man who owned a plantation. There is no way to explain why you are in trouble now." "What are we going to do?" Martha asked, and her voice was surprisingly steady even though a disaster was happening in front of them. Rutledge was quiet for a long time, clearly thinking about choices that weren't possible. He finally said something. "Get in the wagon right now. We need to be far away from here before anyone finds the body." Samuel hesitated, looking down at the shotgun in his hands and then at Caldwell's body, which was dead. "Samuel," Martha said softly, putting her arm around him, "we have to leave. This is our last chance now." Samuel nodded without feeling anything and let her take him to the wagon. Rutledge quickly cleaned up all the signs of the fight and then helped them into the secret room. They were soon driving down the long driveway of the Caldwell plantation, leaving behind the only life they had ever known, and a dead man whose last look was one of shock and disbelief that his absolute authority had been taken away so quickly and completely. The trip to Baltimore was a blur of fear and confusion. Samuel thought about the fight with Caldwell over and over again, trying to figure out how things had gotten so bad so quickly. Did he push the gun toward Caldwell while they were fighting? Was Caldwell's finger on the trigger? The uncertainty was worse than any physical punishment he had ever received on the plantation. Martha held his hand in the dark, where they were hiding, because she could tell he was in pain. "It was an accident," she said quietly. "You were protecting yourself." Samuel said, "That won't matter," in a hollow voice. "I had the gun, and a white man is dead. If they find us, they'll hang me." "Then they can't find us," she said with quiet strength. Rutledge took them to a small house in a quiet part of Baltimore. When they got there, Rachel, a Quaker woman who was known to help people escape slavery on the Underground Railroad, answered the door. Samuel and Martha were very worried that the police would show up at any moment to arrest them for Caldwell's death, so Rutledge spoke quietly about what was going on. Rachel's face stayed calm as she took in how serious their situation was. "The news will spread quickly," she said. "Once word gets to Baltimore, every slave catcher and bounty hunter in Maryland will be looking for you. You can't stay here for long." "I've taken enough risks," Rutledge said, not looking Samuel in the eye. "This is where my part ends." Rachel nodded, as if she wasn't surprised by his choice. "James, you've done more than most people would. Go with a clear mind." When Rutledge left, Rachel took Samuel and Martha to an attic room where they could rest while she made plans for the next part of their trip. "Get some sleep if you can," she said. "Tomorrow night, you'll be on the road again, and it might be a long time before you can get some real sleep again." Samuel couldn't sleep, though. The things that happened that morning haunted him. Caldwell's face, as the shot rang out. The man who had controlled his life for so many years, suddenly being dead. And the blood soaking into the ground of the plantation that had been his prison. He had wanted to be free for so long, but not like this, with the guilt of a man's death, even if it was an accident, on his mind. Martha slept fitfully next to him, sometimes mumbling in her sleep. Even when she was asleep, her brow was furrowed with worry. Samuel kept an eye on her, and was thankful for her constant presence in the chaos that had taken over their lives. They would deal with whatever happened next, together. Rachel introduced them to John Parker, a free black conductor on the Underground Railroad, the next night. He would take them to the next safe house. Parker was a big, strong man with watchful eyes and few words. He was clearly good at his job because he made sure they left quickly. "We'll travel at night and rest during the day," he said as they got ready to leave Rachel's house in the dark. "There are safe houses every 15 to 20 miles along our route, but the trip will still be dangerous. Baltimore has already heard about what happened at the Caldwell plantation. There is a big reward for your capture." Samuel nodded sadly, knowing what was going to happen. William Caldwell was a well-known person in Tolbert County, and his death, especially at the hands of a slave, would not go unpunished. Their trip north was full of dangers. They had to hide in swamps when slave patrols were nearby, cross rivers in small boats on stormy nights when the water was too rough for them to be chased, and sleep in root cellars and attics of kind homes that risked everything to keep them safe. They moved steadily north through Maryland and into Pennsylvania, facing new dangers every day and new challenges every night. Samuel and Martha heard whispers of the growing manhunt behind them as they traveled. The story of Caldwell's death had spread, and each time it was told, it got more exciting. In some versions, Samuel killed his master on purpose and without any reason. In other cases, he had led a violent uprising that could have spread to nearby plantations. Fear and bias clouded every account, so the truth, a desperate fight that ended in an accidental death, was lost. 3 weeks after leaving the Caldwell plantation, they arrived in Philadelphia. They crossed into the city during a thunderstorm that seemed to have been planned to hide their arrival. Their guide took them to a small church in a mostly black neighborhood, where they met a minister named Reverend William Johnson. Reverend Johnson told them, "You're safe for now, but Pennsylvania isn't safe enough right now. Even though slavery is against the law in this state, slave catchers work openly here. Maybe even Canada. We need to move you further north, to New York or Massachusetts." "How long do we have to wait?" Martha asked, and even though she was tired, she was determined. "A few days at most," the Reverend said. "I have people getting ready for your arrival, but it takes time to make plans, especially since your case is so complicated." Samuel understood the unspoken worry. Hiding fugitive slaves was already risky, but hiding a fugitive accused of killing his master was even riskier. Samuel felt very bad about the fact that everyone who helped them was in danger. Samuel and Martha stayed in a small room under the church for a short time in Philadelphia. They only went out at night and always wore disguises. Reverend Johnson brought them a newspaper from Baltimore on the third night they were in the city. There was a story on the front page about William Caldwell's death and the search for his killer. The more Samuel read the article, the more scared he became. The report said that evidence had been found that he had been planning the murder for months. Letters that were supposedly found in the slave quarters showed that there was a bigger plot involving other slaves on nearby plantations. The article said that Martha helped him escape, and that James Rutledge was an unwitting dupe. The most upsetting news was that Isaiah and Ruth Brooks, the elderly couple who had said goodbye to them the night they escaped, had been publicly whipped for not reporting the plot. Isaiah died from his injuries days later. Samuel said, "None of this is true," and his hand shook as he put the paper down. There were no letters, no plot, and Isaiah and Ruth didn't know anything except that we were going to escape. Reverend Johnson said in a serious tone, "Truth is often the first thing to go when powerful interests are threatened." Many plantation owners were scared by William Caldwell's death. A planned murder plot works better for them than an accidental death during an escape attempt. Martha held Samuel's hand and cried for the innocent people who were suffering because they had to leave. She said softly, "We can't change what happened. All we can do now is stay alive and make our freedom mean something." Reverend Johnson told them the next day that plans had been made for the next part of their trip. That night, they would head north to Albany, New York, where a group of abolitionists had set up a more permanent shelter for them. From there, they might go on to Canada, depending on how serious the chase was. Samuel had a realization as they were getting ready to leave. He told Martha, "We need different names. Samuel Green and Martha Turner must completely go away." She nodded to show that she understood. The names they were given as slaves were part of their slavery, and the people who claimed to own them gave them those names. They would choose their own identities if they were free. "From this day forward, I am Benjamin Freeman," Samuel said, and they both understood what the name meant. Martha thought about it for a moment before saying, "I will be Grace Freeman." Reverend Johnson wrote down their new names in a small book that he hid under a floorboard in his office. This book was a record of everyone who had come through on their way to freedom. He said again, "Benjamin and Grace Freeman," and a sad smile crossed his face. "May your new names give you the respect and peace you deserve." That night, they left Philadelphia with a new guide, a white woman named Sarah Bradford. She hid them in her covered wagon, under sacks of grain she was supposedly bringing to markets along the way north. The trip to Albany took more than a week, and there were a few close calls when patrols searched wagons at checkpoints along the main roads. By the middle of June, 1834, when they got to Albany, the immediate outrage over William Caldwell's death had died down, but the reward for their capture was still in effect. Thomas Wilson, a former Quaker, led the abolitionist network in Albany that helped Benjamin and Grace move into a small house on the edge of the city. Wilson owned a printing shop and hired Benjamin to set type. He learned how to do this quickly because he could read and write in secret. Benjamin and Grace felt a little free for the first time in their lives. They got married in a small ceremony led by a kind minister, got jobs, and started to build a life that had seemed impossible just a few months before. But they were always haunted by the past. Every time someone knocked on the door, it made me feel scared. Every new person who came from the South was asked a lot of questions about news from Maryland and the ongoing search for Samuel Green and Martha Turner. Thomas Wilson told them in October of that year that William Caldwell's plantation had been sold after he died. People in Maryland and Virginia bought the enslaved people at auctions. There was no news about Ruth Brooks, and Benjamin and Grace were afraid she had died as well, another victim of their desperate fight for freedom. Benjamin felt the guilt the most. He would sometimes wake up at night calling out for Isaiah and Ruth, reliving the moment they said goodbye in his dreams. The immediate threat seemed to fade a little as fall turned into winter. The people who wanted to end slavery in Albany thought that as time went on, and the people who knew Benjamin and Grace at the Caldwell plantation moved away, they might be safe from being found. Still, they stayed on guard because they knew that a single moment of carelessness could ruin everything they had worked for. Grace found out she was pregnant in January 1835. The news made them happy and scared. They were happy that a child would be born free, but scared that this new responsibility would make them more vulnerable if they had to run away again. Benjamin worked hard at the printing shop, saving every penny for the baby's arrival and the chance that they might have to move farther north on short notice. In August of 1835, their son was born. They named him Isaiah, after the man who died for their freedom. Benjamin spent hours just watching his son sleep as Grace recovered from the birth. He was amazed by the tiny hands and peaceful face of a child who would never know the lash or the auction block. Instead, he would grow up with his name as his own possession, not that of a master. For almost 2 years, they lived in this state of cautious happiness, making friends in Albany's free black community and with the white abolitionists who helped them. Because Benjamin was a good typesetter, he got more work at Wilson's print shop. There, he helped print abolitionist pamphlets and newspapers. Grace took in laundry and sewing to help them make ends meet, even though she had baby Isaiah strapped to her back. Their fragile peace was broken in the spring of 1837. A family from Baltimore had moved to Albany, and the husband, William Barnes, was a carpenter who started working at a store near Wilson's printing business. Benjamin and Barnes ran into each other on the street one afternoon when Benjamin was bringing finished pamphlets to a church nearby. There was a moment when they both knew who the other was, and Barnes's eyes showed shock that confirmed Benjamin's worst fear. This person knew who he was. Barnes was a free black craftsman who sometimes worked on the Caldwell plantation. He had seen Samuel Green many times before, and even though years had passed and Benjamin's appearance had changed a little, he now wore a full beard and dressed like a northern working man. The carpenter had recognized him. Benjamin went back to the print shop in a state of barely controlled panic and told Thomas Wilson what had happened. The printer quickly told Grace, who ran away from their small house with Isaiah and stayed with a Quaker family on the edge of town while Wilson tried to figure out how dangerous the situation was. Was Barnes planning to tell them? Did he know that there was still a reward for their capture? Would he see the link between the fugitive Samuel Green and Benjamin Freeman? The next day, Wilson asked Barnes to meet him at the print shop after hours for a private talk. The conversation that followed was tense. At first, Barnes said he didn't know who Benjamin was, but then he admitted that he thought Benjamin was the fugitive from Maryland. Barnes told Wilson, "I have no plans to tell anyone about him. I left the South to get away from that kind of unfairness, but other people might not be so understanding. Some people who just moved here from Baltimore might have heard of the Caldwell case and might recognize him like I did." Wilson told Benjamin and Grace about this news that night. He was thankful for Barnes's privacy but worried about what it meant for everyone else. He told them softly, "It's not safe for you here anymore. If one person knows you, others probably do too. We need to get you away from danger." Once again, Benjamin and Grace were getting ready to leave. They packed up the few things they had collected while living in Albany and said painful goodbyes to the people who had taken them in. Wilson made plans for them to go to Montreal, Canada, where British law would keep American slave catchers and bounty hunters from getting to them. Isaiah, who was only 2 years old, made the trip north harder. His innocent questions about why they had to leave their home broke his parents' hearts. They traveled at night when they could, following the network of safe houses that reached into Canada. They had to keep Isaiah quiet and comfortable during the long hours of hiding and waiting, which slowed their progress. They got to Montreal in late June of 1837, where they met with people from the city's small but growing community of freed slaves who had escaped from the United States. They found a small apartment for them, and Benjamin met the owner of a print shop who offered him a job right away after seeing some of his work from Albany. Living in Montreal brought new problems: a different language, a harsher climate, and being farther away from the networks of abolitionists they had relied on. But it also made them feel safer. Finally, they were really out of reach of people who would put them back in chains or punish them for William Caldwell's death. Isaiah could play in the small yard behind their apartment without his parents having to keep an eye on the street for people they didn't know. Grace could go to the local market and shop without having to wear a disguise to change how she looked. Their family grew over the years. In 1839, they had a daughter named Ruth. In 1842, they had another son named James. Benjamin worked his way up from typesetter to compositor at the print shop. He eventually saved enough money to buy a small press, which he ran from a workshop next to their home. Grace started a dressmaking business that catered to the wives of Montreal's merchants. Her skilled sewing earned her a good reputation, which brought in a steady stream of customers. They told their kids carefully edited versions of their past, leaving out the details of William Caldwell's death but saying that they had escaped from slavery. They all agreed that they would only tell the children those details when they were old enough to understand how bad things had gotten to cause such a tragedy. In the summer of 1850, Benjamin got a letter from Thomas Wilson in Albany with news that made him shiver, even though it was a warm day in Canada. James Rutledge, the merchant who had tried to help them get away and had brought them to Baltimore after Caldwell died, had died the winter before. Rutledge had apparently wanted to clear his conscience before he died, so he told the whole story about what happened that morning at the Caldwell plantation. Wilson's letter said that Rutledge's story mostly agreed with Benjamin's. There was a fight, the shotgun went off by accident, and there was no conspiracy or planned murder. A lawyer and a minister had written down the deathbed confession, but it hadn't changed the official story that had become set in stone over the years. People still thought Samuel Green was a murderer and wanted him dead. If he ever came back to the U.S., he would still be able to be caught and killed right away. Before showing Grace the letter, Benjamin read it a few times. Part of him had hoped that Rutledge's testimony would somehow clear his name and let them go back to the U.S., where the abolitionist movement was growing stronger. But now, he knew that hope had been foolish. The truth about what happened that day would never be as important as the story that was made up afterward. This story helped people who were afraid of what would happen if enslaved people thought they could fight back against their masters and get away with it. "We've made a good life here," Grace said quietly after reading the letter. Maybe this is where we were always meant to be. Benjamin nodded and looked out the window at Isaiah, who was now 17, and teaching James, who was 7, how to fix the fence around their small garden. Ruth, who was 11, sat nearby, reading a book. She looked serious as she focused on the words. These kids were born free and raised to expect respect and dignity. They were the living proof of what he and Grace had risked everything to achieve. He said, "I still dream about it sometimes. The gun going off, Caldwell falling, and the look in his eyes. I never wanted him to die." Grace took his hand and said, "I know, but his death brought all of this to life." She pointed to the house they had built, their kids playing in the yard, and the signs of their hard-won freedom all around them. And maybe in a way we can't understand, that's just how it had to be. Benjamin kept Wilson's letter safe in a metal box with other papers from their trip, like their marriage certificate from Albany, the birth records of their children, and letters from abolitionists who had helped them along the way. These papers showed how they went from being Samuel Green and Martha Turner, slaves owned by William Caldwell, to Benjamin and Grace Freeman, free people making a life for themselves in Montreal. As the years went by, their kids grew up and made their own way, in a world that, while still very flawed and biased, gave them chances that their parents had not had. Isaiah, the oldest, was good at working with machines and became an apprentice to a successful wheelwright. Ruth got her mother's sewing skills, and when Grace's eyesight started to fail in her 50 seconds, she took over the dressmaking business. James, the youngest, loved words and books just like his father did. He worked in the print shop with Benjamin and studied law at night with the help of a kind lawyer. They heard about the start of the Civil War in the United States in 1861. The war that many had been predicting for decades had finally started, and slavery was at the heart of it. Benjamin read every newspaper article he could find about the war and talked about it with James, who was 19 and had strong opinions about justice and equality, sometimes staying up late into the night to do so. "Do you ever think about going back?" James asked one night while they were cleaning the press after a long day at work. "What if the North wins and slavery really ends?" Benjamin stopped, his hands still on the metal type he had been putting together. "I've thought about it," he said, "but the America I left behind is still there. War or no war. The hatred that made us run away didn't go away just because armies are fighting." James nodded in a thoughtful way. Isaiah says that some of the men he works with are thinking about going south to join the Union Army. They say it's a chance to fight for the freedom of our people. Benjamin said, "Your brother has a good heart, but his life is here now. Our lives are all here." Benjamin thought about the conversation a lot in the days that followed. He had made a good life for himself in Montreal, one that was safe, dignified, and not too rich. But there was still a part of him that wanted closure, some recognition of the unfairness he had faced and the accident that had forced him to leave his home country. In the fall of 1863, that longing was unexpectedly met when a letter came from Philadelphia, sent through Thomas Wilson in Albany. Rachel, the Quaker woman who had taken care of Benjamin and Grace in Baltimore almost 30 years before, sent the letter. Rachel, who is now old, said she had never forgotten them and had kept up with their case over the years. She had just learned something that she thought they should know. Rachel's letter said that Colonel Edward Thompson, an officer in the Union Army, had taken over the old Caldwell plantation. It was now being used as a temporary headquarters and hospital for Union troops. While looking around the main house, Thompson found a secret compartment in William Caldwell's desk that held a journal that went from 1830 to 1834. Thompson gave Rachel the journal because she was known to be an abolitionist. The entries in it painted a disturbing picture of Caldwell's mental state in the months leading up to his death. He talked about having more and more violent fantasies about punishing the people he owned, especially Samuel, whose intelligence he had come to fear. The last entry, written just 3 days before he died, had a scary line. "Green keeps watching me with those knowing eyes. He thinks I don't see him reading the news when he thinks no one is watching. He thinks he's smart, but I know what he's up to. I won't wait for him to do something. Better to set an example now, before the others do what he did." Rachel said that Colonel Thompson was so upset by the journal that he talked to old people in the area who remembered the Caldwell plantation. A former overseer in his 72nd said that William Caldwell had been planning to sell Samuel to a plantation in Louisiana that was known for being very violent. This would have separated him from Martha, who Caldwell wanted to keep at the Maryland plantation. The sale was set for the day after James Rutledge was supposed to leave. Rachel wrote, "I'm not sharing this information to bring up old wounds, but to confirm what you probably already knew. That your escape that morning was a matter of life and death, and that what happened during the struggle was an act of self-defense in the most profound sense." That night, after the kids had gone home, Benjamin read the letter out loud to Grace. They sat together in silence for a long time after that, taking in the confirmation of the danger they had felt, but never fully understood during those last days on the plantation. "He would have split us up," Grace said finally, her voice steady even though her eyes were full of tears. "Sold you off to die in Louisiana, and then left me alone." Benjamin nodded, remembering how Caldwell had acted strangely in the weeks before their escape, like when he had stared at Samuel with a mix of fear and hatred. "We knew something was wrong. We just didn't know what," Grace asked. "And now that you know this, does it change how you feel about what happened?" Benjamin thought about the question very carefully. "It doesn't change what happened. My actions led to a man's death, but maybe it changes how I can deal with it. Caldwell made his choice when he came at us with a shotgun and decided to sell me to you. I didn't choose that ending. He did." The end of the American Civil War in 1865 also meant the end of legal slavery in the U.S. Benjamin and Grace were cautiously hopeful about Reconstruction. They were happy to hear that freed men were voting and holding office in the South, but they were worried about the backlash that quickly followed. Their kids, especially James, who had been getting more involved in talks about racial equality, pushed them to think about going back to the United States now that slavery was over. James said at a family dinner in 1867, "The journal proves that father acted in self-defense, and the statute of limitations for most crimes has surely expired after 33 years. Benjamin said, "The law doesn't work that way for people like us." And he and Grace exchanged a knowing look. A black man accused of killing a white master has no time limit on when he can be tried, especially in Maryland. And a plantation owner's journal wouldn't be more important than 30 years of history that everyone agrees on. Isaiah, who is now 32 and married with 2 kids, agreed with his father's warning. "We live good lives here. Our kids were born in Canada, are free, and grew up without the threat of American slavery. Why take that chance?" Ruth didn't say anything during these talks, but Benjamin saw her watchful eyes moving between her brothers and parents, taking in every word. She was the most like Grace of the 3 children in terms of personality. She was observant, thoughtful, and didn't show her full thoughts until she had thought about all sides of a situation. Ruth was the one who finally suggested a compromise. "Father shouldn't come back," she said one night, finally speaking up about it. "The risk is too high, no matter how much time has passed or what proof there is that he is innocent. But maybe one of us could go instead of him. Not to live there, but to visit the places that were important to your story, like the Caldwell plantation, and maybe even find some record of what happened to Ruth Brooks after you got away." Benjamin was surprised by how much the suggestion meant to him. He had long ago accepted that he would never set foot in the United States again. But the idea that one of his children might visit on his behalf, might see the land where he had been enslaved and from which he had fled, touched something deep within him. "I would go," James said right away. "I know enough about American law to get around safely. And I look enough like my dad that I could see things from his point of view." The plan slowly came together over the next few months. In the summer of 1868, James went to Maryland, where he claimed to be a Canadian law student looking into the legal effects of slavery in the United States. He would go to Tolbert County, where the Caldwell plantation was, and try to find out what had happened to the people Benjamin and Grace had left behind, especially Ruth Brooks, whose fate was still unknown. Before he left, Benjamin spent hours with James talking about the geography of the Eastern Shore, the layout of the Caldwell plantation, and the towns and waterways that were close to where they had escaped. He drew maps from memory, showing the path they had taken that night in 1834, the slave quarters where Isaiah and Ruth Brooks had lived, and the place behind the tobacco barn where William Caldwell had died. Benjamin told his son over and over to be careful. Remember that you're there to observe, not to fix old mistakes. No matter what you find, your mom and I have come to terms with the past. James left for the United States in June 1868. He promised to write whenever he could and to come back in 2 months. Benjamin and Grace had a hard time during the weeks he was gone. They had to deal with memories and feelings they had long ago put away. They did their usual daily tasks with care, but they often thought about their youngest son as he traveled through the area where they had been held captive. James's first letter came 3 weeks later, sent from Baltimore. He wrote about his trip from New York to the South, his first impressions of the city where Benjamin and Grace had started their journey to freedom, and his meetings with people in the local free black community. He had met abolitionists who had known Rachel, even though the old Quaker had died the winter before. Through these contacts, he was able to get a ride to Talbot County and meet people who could help him with his research. The second letter, which came 2 weeks later, had more important news. James had been to what used to be the Caldwell Plantation, which was now split into smaller pieces after the war. The main house was still there, but it had been damaged during the war and then fixed by its new owner, a businessman from the north who bought the property at auction. James had said he was a Canadian researcher who was interested in the area's history, and he had been given permission to walk around the grounds. "I stood in the exact places you said, Father," he wrote. "The drive lined with oak trees, the fields that used to grow tobacco that have been cleared, and the foundations of the slave quarters that were torn down after the war. I found the place behind the tobacco barn where Caldwell confronted you and Mom. There is now a wild rose bush there, and its thorns and flowers mark the spot where your life changed forever." James had also asked about Ruth Brooks and found out, much to Benjamin and Grace's relief, that she was still alive. Ruth was sold to a plantation in Virginia after Isaiah died from the whipping. She stayed there until she was freed. Local records show that she came back to Talbot County after the war, like many other freed people who wanted to reconnect with people and places from their past. She spent her last years in a small community of former slaves near Easton, where she died in 1866 at the age of about 70. James wrote, "The people I talked to remember her as a storyteller. She would gather kids around her and tell them stories about the old days and the people she knew who got away to freedom. She talked a lot about a rider, couple who ran away to the north after fighting with their master. She told how they had built new lives out of reach of slavery. I think she was telling your story, Father, to keep your memory alive and protect your names." The third and last letter came just before James got back to Montreal. He wrote about his most important find, a small group of papers in the Easton courthouse that included depositions taken in the days after William Caldwell died. One of the papers was a statement from James Rutledge that had never been made public. In it, he talked about what happened that morning in a way that was very similar to Benjamin's account of the accidental shooting during a fight. James wrote, "The deposition was filed, but seems to have been ignored. The story of a planned murder had already taken hold, fueled by the fears of other plantation owners who saw Caldwell's death as a threat to their own power." This story didn't fit with Rutledge's statement, so it was quietly put aside, but it was never destroyed. I've made a copy that I'll take home with me. When James got back to Montreal in August, the whole family got together to hear the whole story of his trip. He brought with him the copied deposition, a few sketches he had made of the old Caldwell plantation, and a small cloth pouch that he gave to his father with great ceremony. He put it in Benjamin's hands and said, "This is yours." A smooth black stone about the size of a man's thumb was inside the pouch. Benjamin looked at it with confusion before he realized what it was. He told his kids, "Ruth Brooks gave this to me the night before we left. She said her great-grandmother brought it from Africa, and it had been passed down through generations of her family. She said it would keep us safe on our trip." He choked up as he said, "I always wished I could have given her something in return." James said, "The woman who told me about Ruth had this with her. She said Ruth had given it to her daughter before she died and told her it was meant to go north one day to follow the path of those who had escaped. insisted that I bring it to you after I told her how I was connected to the story. Benjamin wrapped his fingers around the stone and felt its weight and warmth. This little thing had been on a journey that started 34 years ago. It had gone through the hands of people who were connected to the community he had left behind and the people who had suffered because of his escape to freedom. Its return meant something deep, something that showed how strong the bonds were that slavery had tried but failed to break. The years kept moving forward at the same pace. Benjamin and Grace got older. Their hair turned white, their steps slowed down, but their minds stayed sharp. The print shop became a meeting place for Montreal's Black community, where people could talk about ideas, read and talk about newspapers from all over Canada and the U.S., and have passionate and insightful debates about the ongoing fight for equality. Benjamin got pneumonia in 1876, the year the United States turned 100. The illness came on suddenly and got worse quickly, leaving him bedridden and gasping for air. Even though doctors tried their best, Grace rarely left his side during those hard days. Their children also took turns reading to him from his favorite books when he was too weak to hold them himself. Benjamin asked to talk to each of his kids alone on a cold February night when it was snowing lightly outside the bedroom window. He gave the print shop to his firstborn son, Isaiah, along with the job of keeping it going as a place to learn and talk. He gave Ruth his collection of books, most of which he had printed himself over the years. He gave James the metal box with the papers from their trip, which included Wilson's letter about Rutledge's confession and the copy of the deposition that James had found in Easton. "These papers tell our story," he said to his youngest son. "They tell the story of slavery and what freedom could be, not just mine and your mother's. Take care of them, but also give them away when the time is right. The world needs to remember." Benjamin reached for Grace's hand after the kids had left, and only Grace was at his bedside. "Do you remember what you said to me when we talked about Caldwell's journal?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace nodded, and her eyes filled with tears. "I said that everything came to life because he died. To our kids, our home, and everything we made together." Benjamin said, "I've thought about that a lot over the years, how something so bad could lead to something so good. I never wanted to kill any man, not even Caldwell, but I can't regret the life that came after." "Nor should you," Grace said firmly. "You stood up for both of us that morning. That one brave act led to everything that happened after that. Every fight, every joy, and every moment we spent together." Benjamin smiled weakly and looked out the window at the snowflakes that were swirling against the darkening sky. "We've come a long way since that morning behind the tobacco barn." "Yes," Grace said softly, "but sometimes it feels like no time has passed at all, like we're still those scared but determined young people stepping into an unknown future." "I wouldn't change it," Benjamin said softly as his eyes started to close. "Not one day of it." He quietly passed away in the early hours of the morning, with Grace still holding his hand as his breathing slowed and then stopped completely. Samuel Green was born into slavery. He ran away to the north as a fugitive accused of murder. He then built a new life as Benjamin Freeman. But his children, grandchildren, and the story of his bravery and determination would live on for generations to come. Grace lived for 5 more years after Benjamin died. She kept telling her grandchildren their story so they would know how much it cost to be free. She didn't talk about the accident that killed William Caldwell with shame or regret. Instead, she said it was a time when fate had stepped in to set them on a path to freedom. A hard path full of danger and sacrifice, but one that had finally led to salvation. She died in 1881 and was buried next to Benjamin in a small cemetery on the edge of Montreal. The only things on their gravestone, a simple polished granite marker, were their names, Benjamin and Grace Freeman, and the dates of their birth and death. But their kids, grandkids, and great-grandkids all knew the whole story. The black stone that had traveled from Africa to Maryland and then to Montreal was passed down through the family, giving them a real link to their past. The letters, journal entries, and deposition that Benjamin had kept that backed up his story of William Caldwell's death were also there. These things became important to future generations because they reminded them of where they came from and how brave they had to be to fight for their freedom. In 1934, exactly 100 years after Samuel Green and Martha Turner fled the Caldwell Plantation, their great-grandson David Freeman, a history professor at a university in Toronto, put together their story into a manuscript. He used family documents and research he did in archives all over the United States and Canada. He wrote the most complete account of what happened after William Caldwell died and the two people he had enslaved escaped. The manuscript was never published while David was alive. This was partly because he was worried about how people would react to the story in a time when racial prejudices were still very strong, and partly because he saw it as a family history rather than a public document. But he made sure that each branch of the family got a copy, so that the story would be passed down to future generations. David's daughter Eleanor didn't think about publishing her grandfather's manuscript until 1968, when the civil rights movement changed American society and made people rethink what they knew about slavery and what happened after it. At that point, the story was over 100 years old, and most of the people who were directly involved had been dead for decades. The time limit for charging anyone with a crime related to William Caldwell's death had long since passed, and the political and social climate had changed a lot. Eleanor, a journalist by trade, edited and added to her father's manuscript. She also did more research in Maryland, where records that had once been hard to find were now available for scholarly review. What she found in these archives mostly backed up what her family had told her: that Caldwell's death was an accident, that a fake conspiracy had been made up afterward, and that evidence that might have contradicted the official story had been deliberately hidden. Historians studying the antebellum South and the Underground Railroad were very interested in Eleanor's book The Freeman Legacy when it came out in 1972. The documented journey of Samuel Green and Martha Turner, who later became Benjamin and Grace Freeman, gave us a detailed look at how enslaved people made their way to freedom and how the institutions of slavery worked to control not only their bodies, but also the stories that were told about their resistance. Some of the Caldwell family's descendants didn't like how the book portrayed their ancestor at first, but the documentary evidence Eleanor had gathered, which included William Caldwell's own journal entries and James Rutledge's suppressed deposition, eventually convinced them. In 1975, representatives from the Caldwell and Freeman families met at the site of the old plantation to acknowledge their shared history and the tragedy that had brought their families together. This event received national attention. Near the site of the deadly fight, a small memorial was built with the words, "On this ground in 1834, a confrontation born of the injustice of slavery led to an accidental death and a desperate flight toward freedom. The truth about what happened here should remind us of our shared humanity and our duty to protect the dignity of every life." The black stone that had traveled from Africa to America to Canada and back again was put in a small niche in the memorial. This symbolically finished its journey from Africa to America to Canada and back again. A descendant of Ruth Brooks, found through Eleanor's research, took part in the ceremony. This brought the stories of these two families full circle after more than 100 years. People who visit Tolbert County, Maryland today can still see this memorial. It is now part of a historical park that has parts of the original Caldwell plantation and exhibits that tell the story of slavery on Maryland's eastern shore. The story of Samuel Green and Martha Turner, who became Benjamin and Grace Freeman, and the accidental death that led them to flee to freedom, is a powerful reminder of how slavery changed people's lives in complicated and often tragic ways. It also helps us understand American history better. The sound that still echoes from that fateful morning in 1834 is not just the sound of a shotgun going off in a fight. It is also the call for justice, dignity, and recognition of our shared humanity that has lasted through the years. It reminds us that history is never as simple as the stories we tell about it. That behind the official stories are many personal stories of resistance, resilience, and the unyielding fight for freedom against impossible odds. As Benjamin Freeman himself noted in the last days of his life, something bad led to something good. This is a paradox that may sum up the American experience as a whole. with all its painful contradictions and its ongoing fight to keep the promise of freedom for all its people. The legacy of that struggle endures, exemplifying the bravery of individuals such as Samuel Green and Martha Turner, who rejected the limitations imposed by others and envisioned an alternative future for themselves and future generations.